Okay, so let us start. I will stop sharing my screen, and then Justice Mensah can please start sharing his screen. Waiting for Justice, excellent. Very good, that's full screen. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you Justice Mensah from the IFC and World Bank Group, presenting on infrastructure quality and FDI flows. Justice, you have 15 minutes, and I will give you a warning after 10. Floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Niclas. So I'm going to present to you a paper on infrastructure quality and FDI inflows, where we use the arrival of high-speed internet in Africa to really understand this. And I must say, this is joint work with my colleague, Nuhum Traore, who I believe may be in the audience. All right, so as we all know, FDI, it's considered to be an important driver of economic development in many, low-income and middle-income countries. And part of this is because FDI is seen as a channel for technology transfer and employment creation in many developing countries. So as a result of that, many countries actually embark on massive investment promotion campaign, mostly to the developed markets, to really showcase the investment potentials in their countries. So as part of these investment promotion campaigns, the whole objective is to try to offer a lot of information to investors so as to reduce their transaction costs and also reduce any information barriers that may, exist. And even some countries go to the extent of offering juicy incentives to investors, right, by granting them tax holidays, all in a bid to be able to lure investors into their markets or into their economies. Now, in spite of this, the reality is that some countries still struggle to attract FDI. And some scholars and development practitioners opine that this is largely due to the poor quality of infrastructure that exists in many of these countries. So how important is infrastructure to investment or doing business? Well, infrastructure to a large extent influences the cost of doing business. So imagine, you opening a factory in a country where even road transportation it's a struggle, right? So that obviously increases your transport costs and actually eats into your bottom line. And mind you, investors are actually thinking about how to be able to maximize their profit. So this means that investors, holding all other things constant, are likely to target markets that potentially have better infrastructure access. Now, unfortunately, in many when you look at the case of Africa, it seems to lag behind in terms of access to almost all the infrastructure. So if you look at electricity, internet penetration, road transport, rail, if you compare Africa to the rest of the world, access rates in almost all of these infrastructure tends to be low. So the question is, could African countries actually attract FDI by improving the quality of the infrastructure that they have? And this question is essentially the main motivation for this study. Now, essentially what we try to do here is to try to leverage the arrival of high-speed internet in the continent, which was, more or less spurred by the arrival of the submarine internet cables in the early 2000s, to see whether the arrival of this high-speed internet actually spurred investment into the technology and financial services sectors. Now, why these sectors? These sectors is the focus on these sectors is because these sectors actually rely on digital technologies for innovation and then productivity. Now, one caveat I must mention here is that when we talk about the technology service sector, we essentially excluding any investment into internet infrastructure and the telecom sector for obvious reasons to avoid reverse causality, right? The third question we try to answer here is, to what extent does complementary infrastructure actually play a role here? Is it just enough to provide just internet, or you will need other infrastructure to be able to support this to really, maximize the gains? So just before we go on, let's spend a few minutes to look at conceptually how will internet even influence FDI into the technology and financial services. So if we start with the technology services, right, there are at least about two channels. So on the demand side, now, if you go to many African countries, there are a lot of people, particularly the middle class and the youth, that have online presence. And essentially, these people now have access to broadband internet. And that essentially increases their demand for a lot of digital services. So you have issues of online banking, social networking, even ride sharing, etc. This coupled with the population means that there's a huge demand, right, that investors could actually tap into to be able to provide the services that these population are actually looking for. Obviously, in the second part, wherever there's a demand issue, there will be a supply side, right? Now, the internet is largely considered to be a launchpad for digital entrepreneurship. So in many countries across the continent, we see a lot of like technology startups springing up in terms of mobile payments, doing ride sharing, e-logistics, e-learning, etc. Now, as these startups begin and they grow, they require significant investment for them to scale up and even survive in the market, right? And given the relatively low capital base of many African countries, foreign direct investment, which seems to be a key source of capital for these tech startups to actually develop. Last but not least, under the supply side, is that given the relatively low wages on the continent, having access to fast internet actually creates opportunities for business process outsourcing, right? So we have examples of companies that are based in Africa that are actually doing outsourcing contract for Silicon Valley firms. And the reason is that if you look at the low wages with access to digital technologies like what the internet offers, you have a lot of companies that will actually set foot in Africa to be able to provide outsourcing contract to large multinationals in the West. In the financial services sector, the key channel here is technology adoption, right? And here, the two key technologies are worth mentioning. The first one is the real-time gross settlement system. So essentially, if you send money from your bank to another person in another bank, what it requires is that there has to be an interbank transfer for the transaction to be completed. Many years ago, this transaction or this transfer were done through the netting system, which was essentially a manual way of balancing out, right? But what the real-time gross settlement system does is that it offers real-time interbank settlement, right? And there's a nice paper by DeAndre Limodio that have shown that the arrival of high-speed internet actually facilitated adoption of this technology in many African countries. So in 2006, for instance, only 11 countries in the continent actually had adopted RTGS. But by 2020, almost all the countries in the continent have adopted the RTGS. And the paper showed that actually led to a growth in the financial service sector. The last one is internet banking, which seems to be a simple technology that we all use, right? But with the internet banking, essentially banks no longer need to have physical presence in all the communities to be able to provide services to their customers, right? And this can actually expand their customer base. And all of these helps them to reduce their overhead costs and allow the bank to stay competitive. So these technologies actually create, an increase in the actually incentivize growth in the financial sector and actually increases investment into the sector. Now, for the sake of time, let's go into data. So what sort of data do we use? Two key ones. The first one is on FDI. So unlike the traditional FDI data that we all know available on WDI, for instance, which is aggregated per country per year, the data we use here is from the FDI markets, which is a subsidiary of the Financial Times. So this data is quite unique in the sense that it provides detailed information on each FDI transaction. So you know the source country, the destination city, the type of investment, whether it's a greenfield or a brownfield investment, the capital investment, etc. And we use data from 2003 to 2018. Then we complement this data with our internet infrastructure data from Africa bandwidth maps. So essentially, what this data allows us to do is that it gives us the geolocation of all the fiber broadband networks within countries in the continent, right? And also allows us to, provides information on the date of the arrival of submarine internet cables, which essentially connected African countries to the rest of the world. And that was actually what brought faster internet to the continent. So how do we estimate our impact? We essentially use a difference in difference with staggered treatment, right? So, and we do the analysis at two levels, a country level and then the subnational level. So at the country level, we essentially explore the staggered variations in the arrival of the submarine internet cables, which I will show you in a picture very soon. And then at the subnational level, we add a second layer of variation. So once the submarine cables arrived at the coast, they needed to be extended to inland locations, right? And so countries have to construct their own internal like fiber backbone network, on which the last mile and then the middle mile networks were actually further developed. And so we combined the gradual expansion in the fiber backbone network as well to be able to conduct our subnational analysis. So the map here essentially shows you the gradual arrival of the submarine cables, across the continent. So between 2000 and 2018, so at each time, the blue line tells you the new cable that arrived, per year, right? Now, the right graph actually summarizes it, and it's actually showing you for each year how many countries that, the number of countries that were connected to at least one submarine cable. And as you will see, all the action was between 2008 and 2012, right? And this essentially summarizes the variations that we are exploiting in this study.
You have about 5 minutes.
Okay. All right. So essentially, in terms of the models that we estimate at a country level, we essentially estimate a two-way fixed effect, where submarine here is essentially equal to 1 if the country is connected and 0 if otherwise. In terms of main outcomes, we use 3 measures: a dummy whether there's any FDI in a particular sector, the number of FDI, and then the monetary value of the FDI in real US dollars. And then at the same thing, at the subnational level, we add a second layer, right? Connected is essentially whether the subnational district is connected to the fiber backbone network in the country. So in terms of the analysis, what do we find? So we estimate separate analysis for the financial services sector and then technology services, right? So essentially, as you see here, we find positive and statistically significant impact of the arrival of the submarine internet cables on the FDI into financial services and technology services. So just to put some numbers, in column 1, we find that there's an increase of about 18 percentage points in the probability of receiving an FDI into the financial services sector. Now, for robustness, which we also show that the effect that we are picking up here is solely due to investment into financial and technology services and not the other sectors. So as you see here, when we look at all other sectors, excluding technology and financial services, we don't find any effect. Even when we lump all sectors together, we don't really see any effect here. As usual, in a diff and diff setting, you will show, parallel trends, right? So we estimate our diff and diff, and as you will see here, about 2 years after the arrival, we see an uptick in the FDI into both the financial and then technology services sectors. In terms of the subnational, we also replicate the same analysis, right? And as you will see, we also find, the main variables of interest is the interaction between the submarine and then the connected. And we find similar results of positive and statistically significant impact on FDI into tech and then financial services sectors. We again look at other sectors and we don't find any effect, but when we lump them together, we see traces of significant effect. The last results I'm going to show you here is what we try to do, to what extent does access to other complementary infrastructure matter? And here we consider access to reliable electricity. So we group the countries into those with reliable electricity and those without reliable electricity. And essentially, if you look at the interaction here, so this is having a submarine internet, fast internet with the country having unreliable, classified as country with unreliable internet service, unreliable electricity services. And as you see, we find a negative effect, right? Overall, the net effect suggests that although the submarine internet connectivity or the fast internet connectivity increases investment in both countries, the effect tends to be higher in countries with reliable access to electricity. And the effect pertains both for FDI into financial services and technology services. So to conclude, essentially, the main finding from this paper is that in as much as access to internet connectivity benefit the direct users like you and I, as we are using the internet for this conference, it has a positive spillover effect in boosting investment into technology-sensitive sectors, such as the financial services and technology services sectors. But more importantly, what we show in the paper is that, well, access to digital infrastructure is critical, but it may not necessarily be sufficient, as you need analog like infrastructure complement like electricity to be able to maximize the gains from digital connectivity. Thank you, and I'll hand over to my colleagues.
Thank you very much, Justice. Now, our next speaker is Alice Duhaut. And Alice, well, would you mind start sharing your screen? And in the meantime, thank you very much to Justice for a very, very interesting presentation. Let me just take this moment to remind the audience to please put any questions you may have into the Q&A box. And you may not see the questions others are posting there too, but we're collecting all of them. Now I see that Alice is ready, so it's my pleasure to introduce Alice to talk about the impact of Ethiopia's road investment program on economic development. So Alice, you've got 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, Niclas. Here in the audience on top, everybody that has written a paper on Ethiopia RSDP is here. So I'm really happy to have feedback from you guys, Marco and you, Niclas. So here we will be using satellite imagery to evaluate the impact of the RSDP. This is joint work with Simon Alder, Kevin Kroc, Rob Marty, and Arena Vesi. This is it's been a project that we've been doing for a long time at this stage. The motivation was that the impact of large-scale transport investment are still kind of debated, and most of the studies were done in dense, rapidly growing country in Asia, and it was not as well studied in sparsely populated countries. The other element is that heterogeneous effect of this type of program were less understood. Usually you have like a study on rural roads or a study on like kind of highway networks, but the combination of both is less common. So in this paper, what we will do is to look at the impact of the road sector development program in Ethiopia. For the few of you that might not know about this yet, it's a large scale development of roads with like different type of objectives between 1997 and 2016. It continues till now, but we stopped in 2016. And the aim of that is really like help Ethiopia transition towards more manufacturing, but also make better use of agricultural resources or mining resources. In this paper, we will focus on economic activity and land use, and we do basically 3 things to approach the effect of the program. So we look at the short-term impacts and exploiting the spatial and temporal rollout of the program. And we want to look at the long-term impact of the program as a whole, so from 1997 to 2016. And the third thing we do is look at the impact of the change in market access. So compared to the first 2 approaches, here the third one adds an element of, rather than to use a dichotomous treatment, like whether or not you benefit from improved roads, here is like considering that not every road improvement has the same effect, because you might have roads that leads to nowhere versus a road that leads to a big market, right? And so our findings are that the gains from road upgrades are mostly concentrated in area with higher level of initial economic activity, as proxied by nighttime lights, that the road upgrades primarily benefited the larger market, and that fits with the overall migration patterns in Ethiopia from rural areas to urban areas, and that you see a kind of a trade-off between urban land and cropland, mainly that cropland got reduced while urban land increased. So in terms of the contribution, we're adding to that ever-growing literature on the RSDP. Niclas has done something on employment. Marco, I think you're in the audience as well, on employment as well, on trades, on farm performance, agriculture. We also add to the overall literature on the impact of transportation infrastructure. And we add to that a novel type of data set that is less used, and that's on land use, that allows us to look at land use, and that's the ESA, European Spatial Agency, globe cover land classification data. Okay, so the data sources are first, of course, the road network. We consider all weather roads improvement plans and the theoretical speed limit for this. We look at nighttime lights. We combine the DSMP OLS and the VIRS data, basically by recalibrating the old DSMP OLS just to have coverage for the entirety of the program. So from 1996, before the inception, to 2016. It gives us 1 kilometer resolution, and it combines both DSMP and VIRS. And so the land use, the globe cover data from the European Spatial Agency, this is annually from 1992 to 2018, it's available. It's like 36 classes of land cover, multiple type of croplands were aggregated into one. So different type of crops were basically considered the same. And it classified all the, this data set classifies all the artificial surfaces are urban. So if it's like paved in some ways and it's not a road, it's urban. In terms of the data aggregation, we're going to do two things, like look at the cell level. So that's 1 by 1 kilometer pixel around the road, right? We exclude the places that are directly treated by the road. And Kebele, which is the smallest administrative level, and I'm pretty sure I'm pronouncing it wrong, but why? It's because the unit of the analysis for the policymaker, it makes more sense to look at an administrative unit rather than a pixel, right? Okay, so the RSDP, for the few of you who might not know, had like a lot of different objectives, like the different phases. We have phase 5 now. Phase 1 and phase 5 had like federal level trunk roads objectives. Phase 2 and 3 were on regional links and roads, and RSDP 4 had rural roads objectives. In total, it represents more than 100,000 kilometers of road, and most of it was during the Universal Rural Road Access Plan, so phase 4. Okay, so that's just a visual depiction of what I just said. If you look at the year, you have a few blue lines, but most of it is orange and red. So later year after 2000, it's really when, after 2008, that's really when the program like developed. But in total, it's lots of new roads appearing on the in the country. In terms of repartition, what we see is like most of the share of the biggest share of the road improvement were like roads that were from 20 to 25 kilometers per hour, gone to 30 to 35. You also have like new roads built, but less, way less. And in terms of like the provinces coverage, if you look at the percentage of the road upgraded or newly built, you always have like up to about 50% of the road network improved for every province, but Addis Ababa, but that's a pure urban. Okay, so in terms of the trend of variables, well, when it started, so at baseline in 1996, Ethiopia has few nighttime lights, has few urban areas, and a lot of croplands. At end line, you see Addis growing, so that's the bright point in the middle, both in terms of nighttime light, but also in terms of urban area. And from a glance, cropland doesn't seem to change much, right? Okay, our three strategies, as I said, we do three different things. The first one is looking at short-term impact. And so for that, we want to see how long does it take for the effects of the newly improved road to materialize. So if any. So for that, we're going to do a difference in difference / event study design with multi-treatment and time periods. And we compare treated and yet to be treated areas. We use the Callaway and Santana estimator rather than to a fixed effect for the issue of aggregation and the multiple comparison group. And we look at what happens around the road, right? Not on the roads per se, especially for nighttime light, because you might have like entry of the toll road, for example, that are lit just by design in order for people not to crash. So we really exclude the buffer around the roads. And we look at the places that were treated already versus the ones that are yet to be treated. The idea is that this is valid for as long as every 2x2 groups are like parallel trends, and that the moment of the precise treatment time is not correlated with the outcome. So we can discuss that, but the main threat to that would be that electrification follows exactly the same pattern as the development of the roads. And as Niclas documents in his paper, that's actually not the case. So you have some correlation, but it's not entirely done at the same time. The second approach is what we call long difference. So basically, we want the difference in the variables from baseline to end of the program, or end of the program we consider, so 2016. And we will thus here compare incidentally connected areas to all the cables in Ethiopia. And why we do that is because, like, clearly we have an issue of the non-random road placements. The only places that we can say that are not targeted directly are the one that, well, were built between two places of interest. So for example, if a cable is between Addis and a regional capital, this cable might just benefit from the roads despite not being targeted per se, right? And in order to make sure that we filter even more this non-random road placement, we instrument the map of the road network by a minimum spanning tree network, which is fairly standard in the literature. It's been used by Faber in China. And I'm going to present the IV results.
You have 5 minutes left.
Yeah. In terms of the third strategy, we use the long difference as well, but this time we look at the market access. We use a fairly standard definition of market access here. And again, the idea is like the treatment then is weighted by the population the roads connect. So it's not only whether you benefit from a road or not, it's how different is the speed limit and what is the size of the population newly connected, okay? So that was what the minimum distance spanning tree and the improved roads network look like. So fairly good coverage. So in terms of the results, if we look at what happened to the areas around the RSDP roads, what we see is places that had, we don't see clear pre-trends. We always have an interaction, an intersection between the standard errors of the coefficient and the zero line. But what we see is that the places that had above 0 nighttime light, so they were in dark at baseline, benefited the most from the program. It's especially the case in terms of urban areas, right? So the places that had already some nighttime lights, so a grow in urban areas even more. And in parallel, you have a reduction in croplands for the same type of areas. Not the case for areas that were dark. So for the overall long difference results, we have that, again, like improvement in road raise the nighttime light level, but you also have an increase in urban land, especially for the places that were with a high level of luminosity already, and a decrease in croplands. And for market access now, we find the same result. So basically, market access improvements always bring more nighttime light and urban areas and reduces cropland, but it's especially the case for places that had already high level of luminosity at baseline in terms of improvement in light, increase in nighttime light and increase in urban areas. So in conclusion, and I think I'm just within the 15 minutes, we see the largest impact in areas with above median levels of nighttime light at baseline, and that's in line with the existing literature on road and economic activity that shows that area that were peripheral benefits the most from improvement in road connection and not the more remote areas. And we see that urbanization kind of reduced cropland. So about half of the pixel that transitioned to urban land were previously croplands. And that's also in line with other findings by Marco and co-author on the reduction in agricultural employment linked to the RSDP. So that's it for this paper.
Okay, thank you very much, Alice. A super interesting topic. I'm obviously biased in how interesting I find it, but let us move on. We have Felix Forster from Warwick presenting next on indirect network effects and vehicle choice in low-income countries. I see that Felix is now at Ofcom 2. Apologies for that. And please do put your questions in the Q&A if you have them, and then we'll come back to that at the very end. Felix, you have 15 minutes.
Thank you, Niclas. Thanks everybody for coming. And thanks to the organizers for including this paper. I'm going to be talking about demand for vehicles in low-income countries, and in particular, the extent to which that demand depends on the types of vehicles that are already in country when any new ones are purchased. This is work that I'm doing with my co-author Dorothy, who's a researcher at the Uganda Revenue Authority. And I should mention that this work was financially supported by the ESRC at Warwick and then the International Growth Center. Now, why should we care about this? Well, we understand from the existing literature that in principle, used durable goods and machines from international markets offer welfare gains to low-income countries through affordable technology. We also see, however, that old vintages, and this emerges from the industrial organization literature, may slow the adoption of future technologies via indirect network effects. And the intuition for this is relatively simple. Demand for durables and machines depends not only on the characteristics of those products, but also on the extent to which they can be repaired in case they break down. And repair services and spare parts are, of course, provided predominantly for the types of machines that are already in country. And this can then slow the adoption of future technologies if the existing stock, the installed base, is relatively old. And that in turn has adverse welfare implications and some productivity implications, in particular in the agricultural sectors, as some recent literature points to. Now, these indirect network effects are probably present in lots of economies, but we would argue that they're especially likely in low-income countries because of the higher incidence of breakage among older vintages that are so prominent there, and then also because of the limited availability of spare parts due to the relatively thin markets for durable goods and machines, and the low presence of original equipment manufacturers that simply don't oftentimes sell into these markets actively. Now, despite this, the link between demand for durables and machines in low-income countries and this existing stock has not been studied in economics literature before. And this is exactly what we aim to do in our paper. In particular, we focus on a prominent sector, the passenger vehicle sector, where we have lots of data available in a particular country, namely Uganda. And we ask the following two research questions. Does the installed base via the availability of spare parts and repair services affect demand for vehicles? And if so, how much does it contribute to the prominence of old vintages? To answer this question, we draw on a rich set of data from a number of different sources. First of all, we have matched administrative records on the universe of vehicle imports and registrations in the country between 2013 and 2017. We also have the entire vehicle stock available at that point. We have information on vehicle characteristics from an online database that focused on the Japanese market. The Japanese market is important here because it's one of the main exporting origins for vehicles into Uganda. We then have information on the intercompatibility of parts between different vehicles, and this plays sort of a key role in distinguishing indirect network effects via a repair from peer effects, simply purchasing a vehicle because my neighbor did. And then lastly, we draw on an original survey of spare parts traders that we fielded in 2019. And that gives us some information just in a cross section, but on the extent to which spare parts are supplied for the vehicles in country. We then use this data to estimate a structural model of the spare parts market and vehicle demand. And this gives us two estimating equations, one for the parts supply and one for vehicle demand. We estimate those parameters to get a sense of the overall indirect network effect. And then we conduct a counterfactual simulation that gets at the impact that this indirect network effect has on the demand for old vintages. In doing so, we find the following, just in a nutshell. We find a strong evidence in favor of the hypothesized indirect network effect, both from the part supply model equation and the demand for vehicles. In particular, we see that the number of traders stocking parts is roughly proportional to the compatible base, which luckily agrees with some of the modeling assumptions that we're making. And then we find in the spare parts elasticity of vehicle demand that's between sort of 0.5 and 0.8. When doubling the number of traders that offer parts for the youngest vehicles, so those under the age of 12 years in our sample, we find that this moderately reduces the vehicle age by 2 to 3%, but we find that it also increases the number of vehicles coming into the country. So there seems to be just a boost in demand as a result of that. Now, the remainder of the presentation is going to be structured as follows. I'm going to go through some descriptive statistics, then the model and our estimation strategy, the results from our estimation, and then at the end conclude with some final remarks. I'm not going to go through the literature at this point in our contribution, but I'm happy to answer questions on that later if you wish. Now, to the descriptive statistics. This table summarizes the information that we have from the administrative records on vehicle imports in the bottom pane, the stock of vehicles in the top pane, with the year in which each of the vehicles exist in the stock were imported, and then a number of vehicle characteristics that we're just summarizing across the different columns. A couple of things here to highlight are that we have roughly sort of 20 to 40,000 vehicles coming into the country in any year that we're studying, 2013 to 17, with a stock of approximately 71,000 passenger vehicles at the end of 2012. And then finally, sort of the average age of a vehicle coming into the country is roughly 15 years old. So this is a relatively old vehicle stock, but also relatively old vintage already at importation. Now, the second figure here, or the first figure, I should say, the second summary statistic, relates to the intercompatibility data that we have. What's important to point out here is that vehicles have intercompatible parts, not just for any given vehicle make and model, but also between vehicles that are very different. So the data that we're observing is that the make, model, and manufacturing years, so fairly precise. You can imagine that, of course, across different manufacturing years, some vehicles are compatible with one another. But it is the case that even across different models of the same manufacturer and across different makes of different manufacturers, you have compatibility of parts. And this is what we're measuring with this data that we have from this online database. And what I'm summarizing here is simply between different vehicle makes and models that are denoted by the dots, the degree of intercompatibility of parts between any of these different makes and models. And as you can see, this intercompatibility really stretches between different manufacturers and not just between vehicles of a given manufacturer. Now, the third piece of data that we then rely on is this survey of spare parts traders. This survey was fielded in just 1 year, so it just gives us cross-sectional variation. In the interest of time, let me draw your attention to column 5 here, which is just the total across the different locations where we surveyed traders. We have 285 traders that we're going to be using in our analysis. 2 key points again are that most parts are actually imported in used condition. So it's not that parts are just sourced from vehicles that already have broken down in the country, but they're rather imported. This is important because it in principle gives traders the option to supply parts for vehicles that aren't in country yet. Secondly, we see that parts last in the inventory of traders for approximately a year on average, so they stay there relatively long. They're high value items, so that gives traders an incentive to focus on vehicles that are very prominent in the market. And we see this also reflected in the distribution across the different vehicle manufacturers, with Toyota being very prominent, and then Nissan and Mitsubishi. These shares are approximately equal to the population shares of the vehicles in country. Now, let's turn to the model. What we're estimating and the model we're putting forward and then estimating here is a discrete choice model of vehicle demand, into which we're incorporating the spare parts market equilibrium. In particular, we separate indirect utility into a component UIJT, which is just a standard parameterization linearly of vehicle characteristics, and then an additional term UIG tilde here that captures the indirect utility from being able to purchase spare parts in the local market in Uganda. The spare parts market equilibrium is then characterized by a CES utility over spare parts that gives us a sort of a preference for variety of different suppliers, and by monopolistic competition between spare parts traders. We assume that spare parts traders have free entry into the market, and that as a result, the market number of traders offering parts for any given vehicle group G is proportional, is given by this free entry condition. And we find that it's proportional, actually, according to equation 2, to the stock of vehicles in that group G that's already in country, which is here Q of G. Now, in addition to this, we can also use the equilibrium prices, the number of traders, and the number of traders to derive this indirect utility that users derive from the availability of spare parts, and in particular from the number of traders that appear in the market. And we can then pop that back into the indirect utility from making a choice over particular vehicles. Now, we use this overarching framework to come up with two key estimating equations. The first is an estimating equation for the spare part supply market, and it mimics essentially the equation that we saw on the previous slide, where we have the number of traders on the left-hand side, and then the stock of vehicles that are related on the right-hand side here in this square bracket. The key addition that we add here is that we're not just capturing a group of vehicles where we have a sort of a binary relationship of intercompatibility between vehicles, but it is the case that sometimes some parts are only compatible between two vehicles and others are not. So we generate this intercompatibility index and then use that to get a measure of the intercompatible stock of vehicles that is in country. And that's going to be something that's important in our estimation.
You have a bit less than 5 minutes left. Thank
you, Niclas. Now, as you may point out, of course, both of these measures, the left-hand side and the number of traders and this installed base, may be determined sort of by the common factors, and there may be inverse causality between the two. So we need to use an instrument to in the estimation of this regression. And what we do is we use an instrument that is very standard in the industrial organization literature, namely called BLP instruments, or so now newly termed differentiation IVs. Intuitively, what this instrument does is it moves the choices that consumers had available in previous years in our estimation, thereby moving the demand for vehicles, the imported vehicles in past years, and that is a valid instrument for this for this regression for this installed base, to the extent that the number of traders don't predict the unobserved component in the number of traders is not predicted by these past demand shocks, essentially. Now, on the demand side for vehicles, what we do is we use our model to come up with the following estimating equation, which has on the left-hand side the share of any given vehicle J, on the right-hand side linearly vehicle characteristics, and then again this term for the installed base. We also estimate this with the same instrumental variables for the installed base, with the addition that we also include the Ugandan shilling and US dollar exchange rate as an instrument for price, which may also be endogenous in the specification. Now, let's turn to our results. This is the first result for our supply equation. In the interest of time here, let me draw your attention to specification 6, which includes the instrumental variables and fixed effects for a given make and model. And importantly, what we can see here is that the coefficient on the compatible base is sort of roughly similar to 1. And indeed, if you look at the previous specifications with IVs 4 and 2, that is also the case. And that speaks in favor of the model that we've put forward here. Now, turning to the demand model, we get the following results. Here, I want to draw your attention to the first row, which is gives the coefficients on this compatible base measure, and which importantly is sort of the key measure of the indirect network effect in our estimation. The different columns here are separate regressions, and as we move from left to right, we importantly exclude more and more vehicles from the compatible base to the extent that they might be related to the vehicle whose demand we're estimating for reasons other than repairs, services, and spare parts. And in particular, in columns 3 and 4, we exclude vehicles of the same make, model, manufacturing year. In columns 5 and 6, those of the same make and model. And then in columns 7 and 8, we exclude all vehicles that are of the same model. As you can see, we get sort of a positive and statistically significant coefficients mostly throughout all these specifications, which is really sort of key evidence in favor of the indirect network effect that we're interested in. Then finally, we use these estimates in order to get a sense of the extent to which the indirect network effect contributes to the importing of old vintages among these vehicles by doubling the number of traders that supply parts to the youngest vehicles, those under 12 years. And we can see here in the bottom panel, in the bottom gray bars, that it reduces the average age of vehicles. But in the light bars, we can see that it increases the number of vehicles that are being imported into the country. So what have we seen here? I've shown you research on a sort of commonly hypothesized indirect network effect that we studied in the context of a low-income country where we believe it to be especially likely to occur. We've seen strong evidence in favor of this indirect network effect. And we've seen that the indirect network effect from our counterfactual simulation appears to have a moderate impact on the importing of old vintages. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Felix. Very interesting topic. Now, in the interest of time, let's move on straight to our next speaker, which is George KINYANJUI from the University of Cape Town. Yes, we can see your slides. Let's try to make this full screen, maybe. That did not quite work on. Oh, now it's working. Excellent. Okay, great. George, it's a pleasure to have you and talk about price dynamics during the pandemic in Kenya and Uganda. And you have 15 minutes. Floor is yours.
Thanks so much. Welcome, colleagues, and thanks so much for participating in this presentation. This is work that I did with Verena and Doreen. Verena from Oxford, and Doreen at the Bank of Uganda. A caveat to start with, I was surprised when my work was actually put under this section. So you're going to hear less of infrastructure, but I think, it's going to be an exciting one. Let me just jump straight into the building the case. And this is more or less like, trying to figure out the impacts of COVID-19 on local markets. And, as all of us know, as the pandemic actually evolved in the early 2020, conventional market interaction and outcomes were apparently going to be very unclear. And this was a clear case of, concern by policymakers, because then we needed to be very sure what will be the outcome of the containment measures that are going to directly disrupt market interactions. And one of the best ways through which we were going to see this was going to be through price dynamics. And we very well know how prices actually, especially when they go up, how they impact on, or maybe alter budgets, particularly for households that have low incomes. So throughout 2020 and 2021, actually, what was the outlook was that the CPI component of food within the larger CPI was disproportionately higher. And this outlook really was expected to disproportionately be acute in most sub-Saharan African countries due to the over-reliance on imports and the fact that, most of the markets are structured poorly. So therefore, the ongoing crisis, entailed both substantial demand side and supply side shocks, which, simultaneously would have then impacted the prices in different ways. The first one would have been, for instance, a fall in production due to market disruptions and lockdowns would have definitely led to a rise in supply shortages, and therefore, manifest itself in higher product prices. The second one will have also been the fact that, with falling incomes, there was going to be some sort of, negative demand shocks with proponent deflationary pressure. And with all this complexity and the interactions of these shocks, it was therefore ultimate that the outcomes were going to be very unclear and could have actually varied across sectors. So two key contributions to a study that was graciously funded by CSAE and International Growth Center was that we were going to provide timely, short-run to policymakers as they are making drastic changes and drastic measures to contain the spread of COVID-19. In the long run, we also hoped that the tool that we were developing was going to be scalable, as a sort of a data collection mechanism that was going to really inform policymakers and researchers and really go beyond the standard methodology of tracking inflation. Now, quickly, I'll speak about our survey design. Really, given that we were trying to document the understanding of retail prices, price dynamics for essential good items, that were made use of university students or maybe employed university students to be part of our study. And this was basically because they were widely spread across the country and they of universities. So the period in which we were able to collect this data went to over 11 months, starting around March of 2020. And the good thing is that we were able to collect high frequency geocoded retail price data for food items, both in Kenya and Uganda. Now, the outlook of the data is that firstly, it succeeded in really giving us the primary goal of generating high frequency and therefore, the price data that we generated was really important, and we could actually then proceed to use it to estimate the impacts of the lockdown measures. And to do that, we also tried to mirror our data to what was nationally available from statistical agencies in both countries. And remembering that the pandemic fundamentally altered mobility and consumption patterns as well, even above and beyond the immediate government imposed restrictions, we looked for complementary data as well from the public available sources to more or less overlay our price data on mobility. Now, where possible, we were also able to collect data from most branded items in terms of how far they are from consumption markets. And additionally, we documented every government response measure, both in Uganda and Kenya, both at the national and also at the municipality levels. So therefore, this data, especially on these key dates that formed more or less like an event study for us, became very vital markers for the price time series trending. An outlook of some of the data, the summary statistics in terms of the most popular items that we were collecting from both Kenya and Uganda. Rice was taking the first position. But of course, these are just the few of them that we were able to collect. Our survey had in excess of 40 products with different brands. In Kenya, the same, we observed like rice was one of the most popular product that we collected in 39 of the 47 counties. Now, we also benchmarked our data, knowing that there was a lot of possibility that our data could have not captured the disperse in terms of consumption distribution. But we did a benchmarking, especially in Kenya. We used monthly averages that were compiled by the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics. Even though the weakness in this was that it was data that is only collected in Nairobi. But we also had a chance to use the Farmer and Early Warning System network that actually also had a few of the products to benchmark. In Uganda, we used what Uganda Bureau of Statistics had, and in both of the comparators, we were able to point out that declining trends as COVID-19 mitigation measures were easing. Now, quickly into the results, we firstly approached the analysis into an event study. And we employed that event study approach to identify the impacts of COVID-19 shock on prices. For the lack of comparators, because we were not collecting data prior to COVID coming, and especially in Kenya and Uganda, we innovatively used standardized prices for the last weeks of data that we collected when most of the containment measures had eased in March of 2021 as a comparison group. The results showed that indeed prices were high in the initial shutdown in Kenya in April and May, but actually in Uganda, there was a more prolonged effect in higher prices until June and July, given that lockdown measures there were a bit higher. This is the outlook of how price trends looked like. And you can see from the onset, there were higher prices in food items, both in Kenya and Uganda. We can see also a prolonged period, especially in Uganda, up to around July. Then we overlaid our data also on lockdown dates. So remember that we say that we collected every other lockdown measure that was taken in both of the countries. And we were able to see, how price really trended along those lockdown dates. One of the limitations is that these analyses do not, or our data do not allow us to control for seasonality of products, but we actually had an advantage in Kenya, for instance, to use the FUSE data and roll back 5 years before and create averages along the dates that we were interested in, and overlay these ones over our price data. And also in Uganda, we tried to also do the same with what data that we had from UBUS. And one of the good things good results that we found there is that the estimated prices, particularly in April and May, became indistinguishable from zero. And this is more or less like the outlook. For instance, in Kenya, the orange curve here was averages for over 5 years in data along the lockdown periods, especially those that were announced in Kenya. So this was the around when it started and different easing mechanisms that happened. As we can see from the county lockdown or country lockdown, especially that was more pronounced in Kenya, prices were a bit higher, but as restrictions came down, prices were going down, and definitely in Uganda as well. Now we also now
5 minutes left. Sorry.
Thank you. We also did a host of sensitivity measures to make sure that we were able to pick up these price effects. And to this, we were looking at what would be the effects of prices. If indeed people are endogenously forced to, for instance, buy from a certain type of shop, given that they were not able to traditionally move to their normal markets. And in Kenya, from this top curve here, we compared geolocations in terms of responses that we were gathering. And the blue curve here shows the Greater Nairobi and Mombasa that had the most severe lockdown measures, and the rest of the country. And as we can see, where the severity was actually there, prices were a bit higher. In terms of perishable, non-perishable goods, given that traditional logistical measures were somewhat limited, we find that perishable goods were a bit high in prices. When you look at the type of shop, we more or less find stalls that were, most likely to be the go-to shops when people are, locked down in their areas of residence, had higher prices in Kenya. And definitely a similar outlook happened in Uganda. Now, we also wanted to link our data to mobility patterns, how people are moving from one place to another. And to do this, or to measure the change in mobility patterns and activity levels at specific localities, we highly relied on daily indices capturing movement trends from Google Community Mobility Reports. And this is data publicly available. What it does, it reports or captures, the change in activity levels in different types of localities relative to a baseline of 5 weeks that ran from 3rd of January to 6th of February 2020. For each of the days, the indices actually capture the percentage change in activity relative to the median activity level on the same day on the week, same weekday during the baseline period. And this is the outlook of how activities had been affected. As you can see, if I might just take Kenya, for instance, the retail and recreation activities, related activities are in the red, more or less scatter plot. And you can see around the start of COVID, how that was actually affected, and there was less activity during the retail. Now, we tried to run regressions using this data, but one of the weaknesses that we had, our choice of indices, especially on the grocery and pharmacy, or the index for the retail and recreation, was really incomprehensive and not stable over time. So instead, we thought of like using the workplace index, how people are actually going to work, even though this one had also challenges because it then did not capture, the movement, especially on days when the, people were not going to or expected to go to work. So we regressed this on log of prices on the Google Mobility workplace while controlling for item brand and month fixed effects. If in the interest of time, I would have wanted to show a larger, output on this, and especially on the robustness. But this is the simple, finesse outcome that we saw. And especially, the lesson that you get here is that, as mobility was, or containment measures were eased, and therefore there was mobility, prices were actually more or less susceptible to falling. And this was really significant in Uganda and with a higher magnitude. Now, on the conclusions, quickly, when we set out to do this, we wanted to really inform policymakers in terms of what to put into the box of making policies to make sure that they don't have the market, and particularly people who are low income earners. And what we were able to show is that, even though the impact were rather short-lived in Kenya, they were really extended in Uganda, where government restrictions were a bit tighter. Then further, our findings also show that mobility patterns continue to have real impacts on price dynamics, beyond the initial shutdown phase. It is also important to really highlight, that prices, even though, eventually fell back, even only temporarily, higher prices likely had a substantial impact on food security. And there's a lot of literature that also pointed to the same finding. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, George. A very, very amazing tour of some brand new data here. Yes, so this opens up or concludes the presentation part, and we have now time for Q&A. And let me just start with a couple of questions that were in the chat. I think Alice had the first question for Justice, and then I'll read out Marco's question for Justice, although I think Marco is not, let me double check. No, he had to leave, so Marco is unfortunately not here anymore, so I'll do that for him. Alice, please.
Yeah, hi Justice. I was wondering, like, kind of, and later on in the slides, you had reliable electricity versus actual internet connection. So we know that, you might have, in theory, internet connection, but actually with all the power cut and everything, you might not benefit from it. So how do you account for that? And how do you deal with this? And do you have like a way of getting into the actual connection time or the speed or thing like that, or not at all?
Yeah, excellent point. Well, so I think you're actually hitting the nail on the head between ITT and then like ATE, right? So essentially, probably what I should have mentioned here is that all the effect we are measuring is intent to treat, right? So like we don't have data on the actual like internet connectivity like on the ground, right? But exactly like all that we are saying makes sense, because having infrastructure is one thing, but the flow of the service from it is also another thing. But it's at the moment we are data constrained, so we are unable to, really say much on that. Thanks.
Okay, so let me just now ask Marco's question for Justice. So Marco was asking or he was wondering more or less how you are able to run the analysis at the country level, given that the treatment, which is a certain cable reaching the country, is localized, that is kind of hitting one kind of coastal location. How do you then kind of extrapolate to the entire country from that one kind of point that gets better internet?
Yeah, like another good point. So look, I mean, essentially we have two things, right? So you could have your local fiber infrastructure. Like for a very long time, a lot of African countries were depending on satellites. I mean, to be able to route the internet, right? It had two features. It was slow and very expensive. And then the fiber came. So in the country level analysis, essentially the treatment that we are using is once the country gets connected to the fiber connectivity, we are assuming that, okay, the country has the potential to have high-speed internet, right? But of course, that might not be enough because even when a country gets connected, certain places will be discriminated. And that's when in the second stage, we go into the subnational analysis, where in the subnational analysis, we actually account for the actual connectivity within the country to be able to a large extent account for the spatial disparities, right, in where the internet services are.
Excellent, thank you. Because I had a very similar question, because in like Jonas Hjort's paper with Paulsen, right, it's also that you always pretend that the moment the internet, the sea cable comes, the entire country has fiber. And I was just wondering, is anybody actually working on the intra-country expansion of broadband to different locations? Does anybody know of work on this, or is everybody just doing the same approach here?
But actually, I think I've seen a couple of studies at the bank that I'm actually going into this. I don't think they are published yet, but at least I know one or two studies that are actually looking into this.
Okay, super interesting. One final question from my end was, to what extent, maybe you know, a relatively recent paper on if a country does get a new direct airline connection, that is also increasing FDI. And that has a very intuitive mechanism that it's easier for the foreign managers to kind of touch base and check how it's going and establish relationships and then fly home again. To what extent do you think that you're picking up the same effect, or is it different, or are they complementary? How do you think about these two interventions?
Excellent point. Actually, I haven't thought about, but I think it's a so you think of my feed, right? To the extent that the airline connection is correlated with the timing of the arrival, yes, then it's possible that our impact may be soaking up some of these, right? But that's highly based on assumption that the timing of this connection is correlate highly with the airline connection between the
Okay, Justice, I'm not sure if I heard everything, but I thought you said that the timing needs to be highly correlated for this to go through. Yeah. But maybe this could just spur some follow-up work on if we do have these different places where the timing does either align or not align. You know, we can study if they're substitutes even. You know, in a modern era of working from home and remote work, you could imagine that you can either get the fast internet or the airline connection, and the airline is less relevant. Very interesting. Any further questions for Justice? I don't see any now. So then let's start with Marco's question for Alice. And he was asking, Alice, if you could say something, please, about places that are losing agricultural land and how these findings relate to Mensah Gebrselasie's findings on roads driving agricultural productivity up. So I think this is more like a classic structural transformation story here that he had in mind.
Yeah, we're a bit shying away from that because we had stuff on crop yields, but it's less clear how to do that in a very convincing way. So we removed it, and I don't remember, but it was in line with the rest of the findings. Yeah, I think I should look back on this and go back to Marco, but we had stuff about green cover and intensity. The problem, if I remember well, was satellite imagery is probably not the best way of looking at that. And the time series had like fairly huge gaps or like not that granular. So, but that's what I remember on top of my head. So that's a good question, and I will I will look into that again. I don't fully remember.
We thank Marco in absentia here for a great question.
Exactly.
So one question I had, let me just also encourage the other panelists to please also ask questions that are similar to the audience. We still have more time. In the meantime, I had one question on the samples here and how these samples are consistent across strategies, because in the long run analysis, you would need to exclude the end nodes of your inconsequential units. So to what extent is then the short run analysis more like an urban and peri-urban sample that's dominated by towns, whereas the second one is a purely rural one? Can you maybe say something about that?
Yeah, I think it's true. Actually, that's a very good point. We have a table somewhere in our paper that shows that, yeah, you have mostly peri-urban areas that drive these super strong results, right, on the high-speed road. So that is true. It's even reinforcing what we're kind of saying, like the closest to population center, human settlements, the more you benefit, and probably you had a better road as well, or like a higher speed road. So yeah, I think this is a right interpretation of that. Yeah, I don't remember exactly the correlation coefficients, but that was something along these lines.
And so basically you're finding the opposite of Ben Faber then, aren't you?
Ben finds that the peripheral areas benefits more, right? But the one that had the outskirts of the
well, he's kind of in the classic result. It's like that the peripheral locations between two cities are harmed compared to the peripheral locations next to the highway that did not get it. So that seems like the opposite result, but I'm not sure.
I mean, it makes a bit of sense, but Ethiopia is like differently centralized, right? So you really have growth in a star-shaped manner. So I'm not entirely sure that you can extend that way. It doesn't make as much sense in terms of that. I don't know if it's I do think that we find something slightly similar. Basically, the urban areas do not grow out of nowhere, right? They grow around in the outskirts of where you already have settlement. So I would tend to say that it's in line, but in the other opposite direction, if you, the dark area like lose comparatively. So you can see it in the way you want.
Okay, thanks. Justice also had a question.
Yeah, I actually had one, but now I've thought of added another one in my head. So my first question to Alice is, to what extent is migration an issue, right? Because I mean, there's a lot of literature that have shown that once you construct a particular rural roads, right, it basically opens the rural areas to be able to, for people to get easy access to market centers, right? And everybody looks for opportunities. So could people be moving from rural areas to the urban areas? And it may be that it's not an issue, but I was thinking to what extent it's that actually happening. The second part relates to the data. So actually you're using a very long panel, right? 96 to 2016, like 20-year period. If I understood you correctly, some of these are rural roads, right? And coming from Ghana, I know there are instances where the government constructed a road and 2 years later, like all the bitumen is washed off, right? But in your case, you're assuming the classic case where once a place gets treated, it's treated forever, right? But if the quality of the roads, decreases significantly 2-3 years time, how does that, like, in a way affect your results? I don't know if you guys have thought about that.
No, we have thought about it. So I'm gonna the second question first. So yeah, we have thought about it, but what we have is like basically the official plans from the Ethiopia Road Authority, right? And so if they report that the road is still in use and with a certain speed limits, we haven't checked if it's actually the case or if it's like, you know, full of potholes or being flooded half the time. So that's the distinct possibility, right? And it's probably more the case for the lower speed roads than the big highways. Like, but yeah, we don't have a good view on that, and that's totally possible. What I can say about that, and then I'm going to segue to the first question, is that because we instrument the road network improvement by the minimum spending tree, and basically the rural road program was aiming at connecting every kebele in some ways. We exclude that phase. So we really, when we do look at the long difference, it's mostly trunk and federal roads, right? That probably are not that affected. That's what I can say. And concerning the migration, yeah, I mean, that's Sam Asher and Paul Novosat's paper showing like people, if you give them a road, they leave. But then you might also have like improvement in agricultural technology that makes like the yields better despite having less people working on it. So I think this is consistent with what we're saying. Basically, we could add like figure on with the same amount of cropland, what happened in terms of Ethiopia production. My sense is probably that it didn't drop, like the population has grown. And clearly, if you look at the transition between the employment in agricultural sector and manufacturing sector, you had some kind of relocation. And manufacturing in Ethiopia is highly like specific in places that are not rural. So yeah, I think this is a consistent story across the different type of variable, but we really wanted to focus on mostly land use over time.
Okay, Felix had a question?
Yes, I did. It was actually a question that was for Justice initially, but I think it's a more general topic that has come through for me. And that's, it seems as if there's, I mean, you have this complementarity is the name of the game in some sense. And that showed up, I mean, I would interpret the first result that Ellis presented in a similar fashion, which having to have some activity already going on suggests that other sort of inputs are available so that when the road arrives, you can increase production and night lights. Now, in Justice's case, I thought there was potentially sort of a level of heterogeneity in terms of the complementarity, right? Because the sectors where you found strong effects were the sort of financial sector and the tech sector, which presumably rely heavily on the internet, but then also on the availability of electricity, and maybe not so many other inputs. I was wondering the extent to which maybe other complementarities might explain the null result that you find on the non-financial, non-tech sectors, in the sense that maybe having a road available or no road available gives you kind of an average of nothing, but if you split it, you might be able to pick up some effects.
Actually, I think it's a good point. It's basically the responses that I basically have to look into that, and it's actually a good point that any reviewer may likely raise. So thanks.
Just quickly on that one, I didn't want to mention it because I'm very biased here, but the night lights and Alice's results could obviously also proxy for electrification. So maybe the complementarity is exactly from that, but I think it's still an interesting point to be raised, right? That something there is complementary and we need to work hard on finding out what it is. That's an excellent point. Now let's also move maybe to questions for Felix and George, not that, you know, we're heavily biased towards the first two and not the latter. Unless anybody want to start, I'll start with one for Felix, which is, so I think this is super interesting, and do I remember correctly that you also have a paper on the environmental consequences of this, right? Okay, fine. So then let's skip that. That's a different paper then. But one thing I thought was quite interesting was that these elasticities of the spare parts, that's quite large. And I was then wondering to what extent it's actually varying across the car age distribution, so to say. So that if that elasticity is relatively high for really old cars, relatively high for very new cars, which are super complex, and then there's like a sweet spot of like medium age cars that were all kind of like of a similar platform where spare parts are widely available. And have you checked for this? And if yes, would it make any difference to the results? Is that policy relevant, etc.?
That is a great suggestion. We haven't looked into this, but it's very much possible. I mean, we can. What we'd need to do is I don't know how it works in the model. I'd have to look through the model to see how easy it is to implement sort of a random coefficient on the installed base that varies by age. Purely from an empirical perspective, on the demand side, we can do it. So I think that's very worthwhile checking it. I haven't done it, but we should do that. That's a great idea.
Justice.
Yeah, I had a question for Felix. So I'm not sure if it's entirely correct to assume, right? So your studies in Uganda, right? And I quickly checked Uganda just to make sure that I don't say something stupid. It's still a landlocked country as far as I remember. And there's also a lot of literature in the infrastructure space showing that, remoteness, right, has an implication on variety. So, places that are, less connected tend to have very limited variation, right, in the variety of goods that they have. And in the same case, to what extent, I was thinking, to what extent is a landlockedness, right, in Uganda, having an impact on the variety of cars that are in there, right? Because clearly, if I understood you correctly, there seems to be some part dependence in the type of vehicles that people demand, right? And by the case, I think I've seen that in a couple of African countries. But the question that I had in mind is, to what extent is a landlockedness an issue? Maybe, presumably, maybe countries like Kenya that had access to a seaport and probably a lower transport cost, right, for importing a vehicle, probably may have more variety than maybe countries, that don't have direct access to the sea. Again, just thinking on top of my feet, but I don't know if it plays any role here.
Okay, so if I understand you correctly, you're saying, is it possible that, in some sense, the kind of the limited number of cars that we see coming into Uganda are not driven by the lack of spare parts, but simply by the fact that those are the cars that are available to the, in quotation mark, remoteness of the location. I think that's a fair comment. But I think of that more as a sort of an additional component that might limit the choice set. I mean, we can think of different ways in which the choice set that under sort of free trade or some level of international trade becomes available to locations where those goods are originally not produced. Some of those are going to be excluded by the factors that you described. And then as you trickle down, some of them are going to be excluded by other things, including just sort of the overall income level of the consumers, maybe the presence of or lack of ancillary markets, like we're pointing out. So I think they all matter. The one thing I would say on the coefficients that we present in the paper is that those are driven by only the within variation across vehicles. So it's really and the IV, remember, comes from kind of the past choice sets for vehicles in previous years. To the extent that variation in past choice sets drives the kind of the vehicles that get imported, and the variation over time in that installed base of vehicles has a correlation with vehicles being imported in the future and with the availability of sort of with the provision of parts for those vehicles. That's really what we're capturing. So I think it is only one possibly small component of the limiting factors, but but I think in terms of the coefficients, we are picking up what we meant to pick up.
Okay, thank you. And now just finally a couple of questions for George, and please, if you do have any as well, do raise your hand or put it in the chat. I had a couple. I think the first one was apologies to George if the infrastructure theme does not speak to your paper. I was hoping that the spatial integration paper would, because at least in most of these models, price gaps would be the key measure of spatial integration. So that's, I think, where I was coming from. Sorry about that. Now, exactly talking about that, in your results, right, you show that mobility is affecting prices in Uganda, but not in Kenya. And I was a bit puzzled by that. Can you just explain a bit more if this is due to differences in the kind of mobility restrictions that were in place in the one country against the other? Or do you think that the degrees of market integration are fundamentally different?
Thanks so much, Niclas. I think both of the hypotheses, as you put them, were mostly, factors that we are thinking through. I mean, we didn't have like much leeway to, play around with the data that you're having, given that it was that limited towards the prices. And also given that we more or less did not collect data in terms of the integration of markets per se, outside the effects that you are seeing from COVID. But you're right. I mean, from my own experience, I mean, I'm Kenyan and I've traveled to Uganda as well. I think restrictions in Uganda, number one, are very strict, somewhat. And also given that most of the products also, are transiting through Kenya as well, from the import side, we saw more strict measures in Uganda that could have actually then been more pronounced in the results as opposed to Kenya. The other thing is that, I mean, in as much as the restrictions were happening in Kenya, there were, arrangements to make sure that all these restrictions were put in some sort of, basket, or what I would call like regional, economic blocks. Like, for instance, there is no, at no point did we have at least one of the counties really locked alone. There was a bit of, a decisive way to make the lockdowns in a huge, on a bigger, scale, as opposed to what we were seeing in Uganda.
Okay, that's super interesting. I'm also extremely fascinated now by this idea of like Ugandan price gaps and price changes being driven by mobility restrictions in Kenya. It sounds like a great kind of paper to be written here for anything to do with pass-through or spatial integration in Uganda, where you get the exogenous variation from restrictions in a different country. So maybe there's something there. It sounds super cool. Do other people have any final questions for George? Yes, Felix.
Yeah, I was just wondering, presumably the regression of price on mobility captures both price and demand and supply effects, right? I assume that mobility is not just consumers driving to markets, or but it might also be goods being brought there. And I don't know where that analysis would head, but I would think if there's a way to disentangle those two, that might be quite interesting. To get a sense of where the contribution is coming from. I don't know if there's some markets that were not affected by the mobility restrictions, either in Kenya or in Uganda. But yeah, it would be good to know.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that comment. And I think you're right. And as I had pointed out on the start of the presentation, is that all these both demand and supply effects were actually then difficult to disentangle, especially on the outcome in prices, to then know that maybe like what you're observing is really driven by the demand or by supply, given the fact that if it was a mobility limitation, then it was for both the supply side and the demand side. And I think it's a good idea to deep dive into the data and see whether, because of course, I mean, like while some of the places were locked down, and therefore certain markets locked down, some of them were not. Maybe explore some sort of advantage along that line.
Okay, thank you very much, George. I don't see any further questions, and we're also out of time. So let me just thank everybody for participating, for the really cool presentations here. It was a very insightful session, and I hope people have enjoyed it instead of having gone to the pub. So we had some tough competition here. So let me stop the recording and wish everybody a very nice weekend.